This is Risk Assessments Uncomplicated, a beginner's guide to risk assessments. We're recording this on Friday, the 21st of January, so any guidance or government information that we mention during the webinar is subject to change, obviously. We've got with us today Anna Carson, who is a Senior Environmental Health Officer, Alex Baker, who is our Business Compliance Consultant, and myself, Paige Cottam, who's a Business Compliance Advisor. As I said, I'll just go through the disclaimer again that we filmed this webinar in January 2022, so any information or examples pertaining to COVID are in line with the relevant government guidance and therefore subject to change. For COVID guidance, please always review the most recent government guidance on the gov.uk website. And you can email any questions regarding the webinar to business@wakefield.gov.uk. Quickly run through the objectives for today. So we would like you to come away with an understanding of what a risk assessment is and why they're beneficial to your business, to understand the importance of risk assessments when managing COVID and the ever-changing guidance. We want you to understand your legal responsibilities for managing risk, understand the basic principles that actually make up a risk assessment, and lastly, gain the knowledge and skills to safely manage any kind of risk in your workplace, whatever that may be. On the agenda, so what you can expect, we have an introduction to risk assessments, a little bit about risk assessments in practice. We will explore steps 1 to 5 of risk assessment, making risk assessments work for your particular business, and then a little bit about us as the Here for Business team and what we can offer you, and a little bit about our risk assessment check and send service that we'll be introducing for you to take advantage of. I'll hand over to Alex now to tell us a little bit more about risk assessments.
Thank you very much, Paige. So I will be covering the introduction to risk assessments, just to give some background information and insight into the relevance of risk assessments and why they can benefit and are so integral in terms of the operations in businesses. So the definition of risk assessment. So a systematic process of evaluating the potential risks that may be involved in a projected activity or undertaking. So it's basically highlighting what the control relevancy of processes are in terms of the business, to really look at the risks and hazards in businesses and then remove those with control mechanisms to better support safer working environments. So these are just some statistics that kind of give us some real detailed kind of information around why risk assessments are so relevant around workplaces. So as we know, risk assessments are there to try and mitigate any workplace accidents in the workplace. The Labour Force survey reported that 693,000 workers suffered non-fatal injuries between 2019 and 2020. So the Labour Workforce Survey is a study of the employment circumstances of the UK population. 65,427 employers reported non-fatal injury numbers as a RIDDOR. RIDDOR is reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrence regulations. A total of 142 workers in Great Britain were killed at work in 2020 to 2021, an increase of 29 people killed when compared to 113 workers killed in 2019 to 2020. Workplace deaths and injuries have significant physical, emotional and financial burdens placed on the employees, the families of employees and even the employers. The total cost of workplace self-reported injuries and ill health in 2018-2019 was 16.2 million. 66%, 10.6 billion is associated with the cost of ill health and 34% is associated with the workplace injury. It is estimated that it costs individuals 9.6 billion in costs, 3.2 billion in cost to employers, and 3.5 billion in cost to the UK government. So these statistics just really outline the significance and the impacts of accidents in the workplace. When we don't make sure that we're looking at the risks and hazards which need to be controlled to prevent injury in the workplace. It then has significant burden, as we've just obviously seen through some of those statistics, on both businesses and employers, and obviously the employees as well. So in terms of if they're unable to work due to accidents and ill health as a result of accidents in the workplace, obviously they're not then making money, and that has obviously both physical and mental consequences to that individual. So non-fatal injuries to employees by most common accident kinds. So this just gives you some indication of the most common accidents in the workplace. So slips, trips and falls from the same level at 38%. Handling, lifting or carrying. So when we think about things like manual handling in the workplace. Struck by moving objects, 14%. Acts of violence in the workplace, 12%. And at 11% falls from height. Furthermore, fatal injuries, the statistics, so in comparison to the non-fatal injuries, falls from height is the highest at 26%. And we've then got at 19% struck by moving vehicle, 13% struck by moving objects, 10% trapped by something collapsing, overturning, 8% contact with moving machinery, 4% injured by an animal, and 3% for both the exposure to an explosion and contact with electricity, and then 2% at drowning or asphyxiation. So in order to understand some of the barriers, we have to have a think about what kind of would challenge people and put people off wanting to do a risk assessment. That's what we mean by barriers to risk assessments. And these are some of the common reasons why people in businesses, so key stakeholders and our operating managers, fail to act obviously on implementation of risk assessment, design of risk assessment, and furthermore even review of risk assessment. So the common themes to barriers are the risks can't be that bad, uncertainty, so uncertainty around what does a risk assessment look like, putting things off, so I'll start tomorrow, it will never happen to me, so that feeling of, well, things are fine now, so why would it be in the future? Fear and anxiety, so the concern of, am I doing something right? Is it wrong? My staff know what they are doing, so over trusting that staff are controlling their own risks and things haven't changed, which can present further risk in the future. Not sure where to begin, so obviously making a good step by watching the webinar, to taking the first steps to introducing risk assessment to your business if you don't have that already, and or a refresher. Not sure where to get help from, so not sure how to approach local authorities, so Wakefield Council, for potential signposting or support regarding risk assessments in the workplace. And we've not had an accident, so when we look at incident reporting in the business, we obviously then are trying to potentially think, well, we don't need to review or implement any revisions to the risk assessment because we haven't previously had an accident in place. So it just gives you a kind of overview in terms of those statistics and barriers around why businesses sometimes fail to implement and review risk assessment in the workplace. And I'll now hand over to Anna. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So we're just going to look at some of the laws when it comes to risk assessments. So it's useful to understand where the requirements are for the things that you have to do. So the main health and safety responsibilities that we're looking at today are under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. Now, this places duties on companies and individuals to ensure that there's adequate provision for the health and safety at work. Employers must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare of employees and any others that may be affected by what they do. So when we say any others, what do we mean? It could be the employees, casual workers, part-timers, any trainees, customers, contractors, and it could be include those that are affected by your work activity. So it could be neighbours, sales people that might be out and about, or members of the public that come in as customers, or may even be passing by your workplace, or if you work out on site, people in other businesses, etc. Now, the actual requirement for a risk assessment is under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. So here is the legal duty to assess the risks to the health and safety of your employees and those not in your employment, as we've already mentioned, to which they are exposed while they are at work or whilst you're carrying out your work activity. It's also really important to consult your employees and health and safety representatives. Your employees and your staff, if they're involved, they're the people that do the work, so they know the risks that are involved, the potential for shortcuts and problems that they might regularly face, or might have ideas of how to do things more safely by making simple changes. And if you involve your employees, they're more likely to understand why the procedures have been put in place, and they're more likely to follow them as they've got a bit of investment in them. So it's a really good idea to involve your staff. Now, there are many laws that cover health and safety, but these are the main ones that are relevant to what we're talking about today. So what are the practical steps to keeping you and your employees safe? So we've mentioned the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. This is where the requirement is for risk assessment. So the minimum that you must do is identify what could cause injury or illness in your business. Now, these are known as the hazards, and decide how likely it is that someone could be harmed and how seriously they may be harmed. And this is what we call the risk. Once we've looked at the hazards and the risk, we then need to take action to either eliminate the hazard, and if it can't be eliminated, we need to control that risk. And assessing risk is just one part of the overall process used to control risks in your workplace. Essentially, we're wanting to put things in place that means that people go home safely and uninjured at the end of the day.
So I'll talk just a little bit about hazards versus risks to help contextualise and help with that understanding of what the difference is between them. So the hazard itself refers to the source of the potential harm or danger, whereas the risk refers to the possibility of injury or harm when somebody is exposed to that hazard. So we'll just go through some really obvious examples to help contextualise that a little bit. So obviously a hazard would be a shark in the sea. The risk only comes in when you go swimming with that shark. Similarly, the hazard could be a toxic cleaning chemical, but the risk only comes in when you are asked to clean the oven with that chemical. Driving on the road is the hazard, but the risk only comes in when you're driving while snowing, for example, or in any poor weather. And it goes on and on. Obviously, salmonella bacteria in chicken, but the risk only comes in when you're eating that raw chicken. And same with sort of lightning, bad weather again, the risk only is there when you're working outside where there might be lightning. So it's just sort of giving you a little bit of context and a way to differentiate between where the hazard and the risk is, because obviously you can't eliminate all hazards from life, but you're right, you can control some risks.
Thanks, Paige. So the main focus of today is to look at risk assessment, and it's easier to break it down into steps. So we have the 5 steps of risk assessment. So the first step is to identify the hazards. The second step is to assess the risk. And as we've just pointed out, the hazard and the risk are 2 slightly different things. We then look at how we can control the risks. We then look at recording our findings. And then there is also a requirement to review the controls as well. And we're going to look at each step in more detail. So the first step is to identify the hazards. So what do we need to do? Well, think about what can cause harm. And as we've said, these are the hazards. So review your workplace and the activities that you carry out to understand what could cause harm. Now, a way to do this is to walk around your workplace and look at the environment. So, is there lighting, adequate lighting? And think about different times of year. If you're walking around in summer, think about what will it be like in winter? Will I have adequate lighting? Are there any trailing cables that people could trip over or other trip hazards? Are there any open edges that people could fall off? So these are the kind of things we're looking at. Look at the equipment. Is it all in full working order? Are there safety guards in place for that equipment? We can look at the substances. What materials are we using, or what ingredients or chemicals do we use? What do the instructions say about whether they're hazardous or not? And another thing you can look at is instruction manuals and guides for use. So these often have details of the hazards, and they often have how you can use them safely. And the final thing to look at when trying to identify hazards is the task and how they are carried out. Another thing you can do to identify hazards is review accident and ill health records. And this can also help you identify any less obvious or recurring hazards. So it can give you really useful information, especially if you record near-miss information. So this might be something that hasn't quite led to an accident or an injury, but you might notice that something's happened a few times, and next time it could be the time it leads to an injury. It also helps to spot hazards that are harder to find. For example, manual handling or work-related stress. You might find when you're looking through records that you've had quite a few members of staff off with a similar injury who work in a similar role, or a back problem. Could this actually be related to the way that the task is being carried out? The third thing you can do is to consider how contractors, visitors, and members of the public may be harmed in your place of work. This may be different to how your employees work within the workplace. We have mentioned this already, but involve and speak with your employees, as they are often familiar with the hazards that sometimes go unnoticed. And consider any sporadic work that might need to be carried out by contractors that doesn't normally form part of your workplace's rhythm and routine. So maybe you have contractors come in to service high-level lighting or carry out high-level cleaning. So that you also need to consider how that interacts with your workplace. And think about vulnerable workers. So when we talk about vulnerable workers, we mean young workers, migrant workers, especially if their first language isn't English, expectant mothers, and people with disabilities. The risk can often be different for these groups of people. For example, young people using dangerous machinery. And there is a requirement for you to consider these vulnerable workers as a separate category. And be aware of hazards that don't have an immediate effect. It's sometimes easy to spot that a machinery doesn't have a correct guard on and could quite quickly lead to an injury. But there are some hazards that will build up over time, and examples of this would be exposure to noise or possibly asbestos. Now, Alex mentioned before that the costs of accidents, injuries and ill health, the costs are over 60% for ill health. So these are hazards that we really should be looking hard to spot. And it can include, as I've mentioned, hearing loss as a result of exposure to noise, stress, backache, repetitive strain injury if people are doing a lot of typing, and asthma, and that could be in workplaces that are working with dust, etc. And also certain cancers if you're using certain materials. Thanks, Paige.
Thank you.
So it's really useful to have an example to try and put the steps into practice. So let's look at COVID, because a lot of our time's been taken up by COVID, as I'm sure yours has. So we'll use that as our example. Okay, so the second step is to assess the risks. So once we've identified the hazards, we then need to decide how likely it is that somebody could be harmed and how serious that harm could be. And this is what we call assessing the level of risk. Now, the way to do this is to decide who might be harmed and how. So we've already mentioned a number of times who we need to consider. But at this step, we need to look at exactly who might be harmed by the hazard. For example, in the main retail areas of a shop, the employees and customers might be at risk, but in the stockroom, only the employees will be at risk. Now, sometimes in a larger business, you might see a scoring matrix used, which determines if the level of risk is high, medium, or low. But I'm not going to go into this today. But it could be something that you see in guidance, and if you needed any support on, you could contact us. Then you need to look at what you're already doing to control the risk. You will already be doing a lot without realizing it. You might prevent customers having access to certain areas. You'll be cleaning up spillages as you go. You might lay down expectations of visitors on site. Or you're fixing and repairing things as they're noticed, or you might have daily, weekly, or monthly checks in your workplace to pick up issues. Or maybe you have PAT testing or electrical installation checks or gas safety checks. These are all things that you're doing to control the risk. Now, you need to look at each hazard, look at the risk, and see what you need to do to control that. So now you've looked at the hazards and risks with fresh eyes, you might decide that you need to put more controls in place. And there's lots of tools to help you do this. There's the HSE, so the Health and Safety Executive website, and this has lots of resources and guidance on it. You may be a trade body or an industry publication for the sector of work that your workplace is in. Now, when you're looking at guidance such as that, make sure it's from a reliable source and not based on something that you've possibly seen on social media, for example, or a press article without checking the facts behind that before you take that on board. And then the last steps, if you've identified that you need to carry out some further actions, is to decide who is going to carry out that action and when that needs to be carried out by. This will then help you plan your actions and ensure that they are carried out and can be signed off. So if we go back to COVID-19 on our example on the next slide. So who might be harmed? Well, COVID-19, if it's in the workplace, it's going to be in the air within the workplace. So who might be harmed? Employees, visitors, contractors, volunteers, customers, or other workplaces if you're in a shared building, or if you're in a workplace where you have shared facilities with other businesses. So basically everybody could be affected by COVID-19. Then we evaluate the risk. So we know that COVID is out there, and we know that at the moment, and we're talking about January 2022, that the COVID rates are really, really high. So it is likely that it's going to be brought into the workplace. It's foreseeable, is what we would say. Now, what do we mean by foreseeable? So the legal definition is that it's sufficiently likely to occur that such a person of ordinary prudence would take it into account in reaching a decision. So more simply put, it's reasonably anticipated. And it's important to note that you're only expected to consider risks that are reasonably foreseeable. So whilst COVID should be a mild illness for most, we've talked about vulnerable groups. So if your business caters for people who may be more severely affected by COVID, you will want to take this into consideration and check what the most up-to-date guidance is for these groups. And this would be the same if you had a more vulnerable employee. And then what are you already doing to control the risk? So are you aware of and following current legal requirements and guidance? And we'll come on to this in more detail in a minute. So we talked about controlling the risks, and this is the next step. So look at what you're already doing and the controls you've already have in place, and then ask yourself, can I get rid of the hazard altogether? And if not, how can I control the risks so that harm is unlikely? Now, if you get rid of the hazard altogether, then you've eliminated the risk as well. You've eliminated the risk, you've eliminated the hazard. There is no chance of any harm, so injury or ill health to the person that may be affected. It's not always possible to remove the hazard or remove the risk. So then we need to manage it by having controls in place. So look at, could we redesign the job? So can the job be done differently? For example, are heavy items stored at mid-height rather than low down or high up? Because taking heavy materials from mid-height puts a lot less strain on the back. Or can equipment be used that may make the job safer? If the job can't be redesigned, we would then look at, can we replace the materials, machinery or process? So some examples here would be, can we use a chemical that is less hazardous? This would replace the hazard with a different hazard, but it may involve less risk. Or is there a different machine that we can use that can make the job safer? If we can't make changes at this step, we would then look at organising the work to reduce the exposure to the materials, machinery or process. And so this would be working in such a way that reduces the risk to that person. And then we would look at identifying and implementing practical measures to work safely. So this is having rules and procedures in place that everybody must follow. So we're making sure that everyone is aware of the risk and how they should be working and what they should be doing to make sure that they're not putting themselves at unnecessary risk. So this makes sure that everyone's aware of the risk and what they should be doing. For example, it might involve staff training not to carry full pans of hot liquid with no lid. Now, carrying a half full pan with a lid would reduce the risk of spillage and therefore burns to any employees. And then as a last resort, PPE could be provided, but this should only be an option when all the other ways to reduce the risk have been considered. Now, you might sometimes hear the term hierarchy of controls, and that's what we've just gone through. Eliminate the risk is the preferred option. If not, you work your way through these in that order to try and control the risk. And as I say, with the provision of personal protective equipment as a last resort. So we'll be going back to our example scenario of COVID. Now, there's working safely guidance on the government website, and we've typed out the link there if you're not aware of where it is. Now, in the working safely guidance, it tells you what you need to do for your type of business to control the risk of COVID-19. And if there is specific guidance or laws out there that tell you what you should do, all we would ever expect you to do is follow that guidance. And if you're following that guidance, you're doing everything you can to try and protect the people within your workplace. So the Working Safely guidance says that you should complete a health and safety risk assessment that includes the risk from COVID-19. And if you haven't already got one, you'll be able to do one no problem after this webinar. Another way to control COVID-19 is provision of adequate ventilation. COVID-19 is airborne, so people breathe it out and other people breathe it in. If you have adequate ventilation, you're bringing in fresh air to replace the air that potentially has a build-up of COVID-19. People should be cleaning more often, and this is particularly relevant for touch points, so door handles, tap handles, kettle handles, and things like that. Turning away people with COVID-19 symptoms. If you're turning them away and people are staying away from the workplace, then it's hopefully not coming in and therefore can't be passed on to other people. The Working Safely guidance currently talks about enabling people to check in at your venue. Now, this is relevant to some venues such as hospitality and leisure and visitor attractions. There is a legal requirement at the moment for COVID passes, but as we know with COVID, the guidance and regulations change very often. But they still encourage you to have a record of who's been in your workplace in case they need to be traced. And communicate and train your staff in all the control measures that you have in place for COVID. And the other thing at the moment that the Working Safely guidance talks about is reminding staff and customers to wear face coverings in indoor spaces where this is required by law. Now, this was reintroduced on the 30th of November last year and is about to change, that there will be no legal requirements, but the guidance is still to remain that it is recommended that people wear face coverings in indoor spaces where they're going to come into contact with other people that they usually would not see. So you may want to keep these in place in your risk assessment as an extra level of protection to your staff. So the fourth step is to record your findings. If you employ 5 or more people, it's a legal requirement to record your significant findings. And the significant findings include the hazards that we've identified, so the things that may cause harm, who might be harmed and how, and what you're doing to control the risks. And these are the steps that we've already talked through already. Now, to record your findings, on the Health and Safety website, there is an example template, and there are also lots of example risk assessments. You can search by business type, and there's lots of examples there. So it's a really good resource to have a look on there to help you. If you don't employ 5 or more people, there is no legal requirement to record your significant findings. However, we would highly recommend that you do. If there was an accident in the future, and you've got records that show your thought processes, then this obviously can help you in any defence if it ever got to that point. But the legal requirement is if you employ 5 or more people. So the next slide that Paige is bringing up shows us the example risk assessment template from the Health and Safety Executive website. And you can see the steps that we've talked about are across the top, and then the hazards are in each column. So it's really good layout and helps break things down and really helps you focus your mind when you're trying to do your risk assessment. Now, the last final step is to review the controls. So you must review the controls that you've put in place to make sure they're working. You might wonder when you need to review them. So you should review your risk assessments regularly to make sure that they're up to date. And then there's also certain things that should trigger a review of your risk assessment. So at any point that you think they may no longer be effective, if you've had any changes in the workplace that could lead to new risks, have you changed staff? Are you now employing somebody who's classed as vulnerable? Has somebody recently told you that they're pregnant and therefore you'd need to review your risk assessment? Have you changed a process? Have you got new equipment, or are you using different substances or materials? All these things should trigger you to look at your risk assessment and ensure that it's still relevant. Also consider a review if your workers have spotted any problems, or if there's been any accidents, near misses, or people off work with poor health. And then if laws or guidance are updated, this should also trigger you to read through the guidance or the new laws and ensure that your risk assessments are still up to the same level as the law or guidance. And remember to update your risk assessment record with any changes that you've made. And I'm just going to pass over to Alex, who's going to summarise what I've talked about.
Excellent, thank you, Anna. I think we can all agree that was a really comprehensive walkthrough of the 5 steps to risk assessment. So just to recap on the points we've discussed, so where possible, include all staff in the risk assessment process, as staff are often aware of shortcuts and poor practices which can cause harm. So really important. So right from the cleaner through to the director, it's really important that all members of the team are involved in obviously the designing and implementation of risk assessment. And as we've identified there, just because they will know the operation and the operating protocols in the business better than most people, because they're dealing with them every day and will be familiar with any of the shortcuts or things that perhaps would obviously contribute to poor practice and subsequently harm. The workplace must be engaged on all components of the risk assessment and understand how it applies to their role and what must be done to control the risk or risks to keep them safe at work. So again, think about how are you as the person who's engaging the team on the risk assessment, what type of forums are you using to keep people engaged? So if there's any obviously rollout of new risk assessments or control measures that form part of that risk assessment. How are the staff being engaged on those? Is it through newsletters? Is it through word of mouth? Is it through team briefings? All of those different components, and or sharing, a webinar as the same as this one or similar, to keep people educated. Ensure that a competent person is appointed to carry out and review the workplace risk assessment. So Anna spoke in detail about the importance of this, and it's really relevant and important to ensure that the right person who has the knowledge and skill set to understand the 5 principles of risk assessment is really leading on the workplace risk assessments and ensuring that all of the steps that form part of that 5-stage step of risk assessment are included, and the team are aware of what part they play. It is essential that risk assessments are reviewed regularly and updated to reflect any revisions to existing or new processes. So ensuring that any changes to any of the standard operating procedures also are then updated with a reviewed or refined risk assessment that obviously meet the requirements of any new operating procedure implemented, and just ensuring that anything from the incident or accident reporting is then also reviewed in line with also the existing risk assessments and processes to improve any control measures needed to keep the workplace safe. Risk assessments also drive a health and safety culture, and that's ultimately what we want you to do in your workplace to better support yourselves and your staff in keeping safe. So I'm going to pass over to Paige, who's just going to talk a little bit about life is about managing risk and not taking any. Thanks, Paige.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, so moving on. As we said, life is about managing risk and not about not taking any, and we just want to reiterate that we are here to support you. If you've got any further questions from the webinar, then obviously you can speak directly to us via business@wakefield.gov.uk. Just a little bit more about Here for Business and who we are and how we can help. We like to think of ourselves as a one-stop shop in all things regulatory compliance. So we offer consultancy, advice visits, training in health and safety, food, first aid, a few bits more, and general things also to do with COVID and much more, plus some more webinars and really helpful how-to videos that you can find on our webpage. We also have a few testimonials on our web pages, so if you'd like to visit those, you can look there and get an idea of what businesses we've worked with already as well. We'd just really like to reassure you that environmental health and regulation doesn't have to be scary, and we are here to help. So you can look on our Business Advice Services website if you search Here for Business to see what else we can offer. One of the things that we would really like to offer to you and draw your attention to is a risk assessment check and send service that we're launching. So we hope by now you feel confident to go back to your workplace and design a really effective risk assessment. Our risk assessment check and send service means that once you've done this, you can send it back to us and receive some helpful hints and tips and recommendations, because we know that it's so much more reassuring to be able to soundboard these things off a professional in particular. So I'll just talk you through the steps. If you complete your workplace risk assessment using the HSE template that we showed earlier, you can find this by searching HSE risk assessment templates into Google. If you want to then complete the check and send pro forma that you can download from our Business Advice Services webpage that I mentioned on the previous slide, and then email both of those, your risk assessment and the pro forma, to business@wakefield.gov.uk using the subject heading check and send. And then give us about 4 to 6 weeks for us to check it, and we'll send it right back to you. We'll give any feedback that we might need, or just some reassurance. We really hope that you take advantage of that. We really want to help foster that environment of health and safety within your workplace, as Alex said in the previous slides. We've also included here just some useful links, obviously for you to type into Google. So we've got some of the HSE ones that we mentioned. We've got our own web pages, our Here for Business web pages, where you can find the Working Safely guidance and just some other bits. So it's really, really worth looking through those and seeing how they can help you in your business. And lastly, from me, Alex and Anna, and from the whole Here for Business team, we'd just like to say thank you for watching our webinar and for taking the health and safety of your business into your own hands. We really, really hope that you found it useful. If you have any queries about risk assessments or about anything at all, or if you'd like to send any feedback about the webinar itself, please email business@wakefield.gov.uk. And for any COVID-19 inquiries, you can also email covid19enforcement@wakefield.gov.uk. Good luck to everyone with your risk assessments, and thank you again.